The story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis starts with two humans who are wholly obedient to their God. But due to the temptation of a serpent, this relationship between the first people and God becomes strained. Eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge seemingly results in a profound psychological transformation, causing Adam and Eve, who begin their lives as relatively unconscious beings, into self-aware, conscious humans who are ashamed of their nakedness. As Edinger writes, eating the forbidden fruit marks the transition from the eternal state of unconscious oneness with the self, the mindless animal state, to a real, conscious life in space and time. In short, the myth symbolizes the birth of the ego. Notice how Adam and Eve go from trusting and obeying God to having their own egos, through which they are aware of themselves. However, this peculiar transformation might not be purely mythological, but rather it might be a representation of a historical development in the psychology of human beings. In this video, I want to demonstrate that there is a connection between the idea of God and that of the ego, and that the metaphysical idea of God was a necessary precursor for our own egoic state of mind. This connection has its fundamental roots in primate evolution, and can be viewed as a psychological continuity between the primitive, preconscious state of mind and our present self-reflecting and self-aware ego mentality, which makes human beings unique. We should note that the ego is a very complicated structure that can't simply be reduced to the idea of God, and so this video is somewhat of an oversimplification of its origin. It is also important to remember the fact that the ego is subject to considerable evolution throughout the course of one's life, as it deflates and grows bigger. Despite this, we should still be able to note a connection between the psychological phenomenon of a god and that of the ego. Describing the nature of this connection will work best if we categorize three general phases in our psychological evolution. We can call these stages preconscious, God-volitional, and self-volitional/egoic. Human psychology has seemingly passed through these stages, although their exact cause is rather speculative and will need to be left for a future video. And these stages are not necessarily discrete, especially once consciousness arises, as people can have varying degrees of consciousness. The pre-conscious stage is the instinctual state of mankind, which predominated for most of man's history, and humans in this state are not very well differentiated from animals. This stage is the hardest to characterize, because, as conscious people, it is immensely difficult for us to imagine what it would have been like to be unconscious. Pre-conscious humans are still quite intelligent, and capable of learning the many difficult skills needed for survival, and producing some forms of technology like sharpened flint stones. But all of this learning occurs without consciousness, i.e., without any conception of the self. During most of this period of history, human beings didn't even have names, and try to imagine having a self-concept without having a name. Even certain forms of thinking and problem-solving seem to have no conscious component. The most important thing to understand is that the human capacity for abstract thinking would have been limited and underdeveloped. As such, the worldview of a human would consist entirely of his or her immediate observations, with little regard for fictions or imaginations, and it would have been difficult or even impossible for early humans to project internal mental concepts onto a physical environment. Rather, the world would have been perceived as purely concrete. In contrast, conscious humans can think about things or places which are not in the immediate vicinity, such as when you think about what is behind you right now. What we need to keep in mind for this explanation is that human behavioral interactions occur at a face-to-face level. This sounds obvious, but we will see why it is significant in a moment. As explained in this video, one of the main principles governing social interactions in animals is dominance. Roughly speaking, each animal in a group has a rank relative to the others, and animals who are subordinate must give way to animals that are dominant. In a face-to-face interaction with a dominant individual, the subordinate must restrain their own behavior and act in a way which signals submissiveness. This encounter with the perceived superior produces a sort of psychological stress which causes them to restrain themselves, and one may begin to see how this behavioral response precedes self-awareness. The subordinate must condition his behavior in order to appease the dominant. He or she can't simply be themselves, but but must behave in a way which does not produce anger in the dominant individual, and we can liken this response to having to wear a kind of social mask. This behavior is readily observed in social animals such as wolves, who must lower their heads as a sign of submissiveness in order to maintain social stability, as any perceived challenge may initiate a fight. It is the same in primates, who must offer submissive behavior when confronted by superiors. Without the ability to think in abstract terms, this submissive behavior only needs to occur in the presence of a superior, and in psychological terms, we can think of this behavioral system as a way for the individual to recognize the presence of another individual. This recognition is not conscious, in that the individual does not construct a mental analog of the superior individual in their mind, as conscious people do when they interact with others. Rather, it is behavioral and instinctual, but this archetypal behavior is the foundation of self-awareness, especially once this behavioral archetype is applied to different situations. As explained in this video, we can attribute our consciousness to our capacity to think in abstract terms, and this mentality has its basis in language. There is evidence that this capacity evolved into the human species around 70,000 years ago, and it is only past this point that the next two stages can develop. Language undergoes considerable development, as words are no longer signals to convey rudimentary information, but can now specify meanings to an astonishing degree. Language creates an analog of the world, or an imaginary recreation of the world, which includes very abstract concepts. It is past this important development that humans become capable of imagining things that don't exist in the immediate environment. This includes the idea of God, which is a significant psychological development that we observe in every early civilization. A god can roughly be defined as an imaginary or hallucinatory presence, which has its origins in the nervous system of a given individual. This presence is always understood as a dominant individual, and is felt to be genuinely real to that person. We have explained one psychological mechanism for this, known as the bicameral mind, and the gods according to this theory would have been hallucinatory voices originating from certain regions of the right hemisphere of the brain. Within the origins of the concept of God, as either a hallucinatory presence or as a purely imaginary invention, a radical shift in mentality has now occurred. The individual can now feel the presence of this authoritative dominant figure at all times, and so his or her behavior is at all times controlled and must always behave in a submissive manner. The laws and commands decreed by the gods, such as the rules outlined in Hammurabi's code, would have been interfering with the natural instincts of the person, much in the same way that a dominant animal would control or pacify the behavior of the subordinate. In this sense, gods are actually a psychological extension of primate behavior. This psychological control of behavior stems from the person's own mind, but it is felt as the command of an external superior presence. This makes sense because we are more likely to obey a command if it is coming from someone who we perceive to be superior, such as when you do what your boss tells you to do. This behavioral mechanism is able to extend the range of behaviors far beyond the natural instincts of the person, and it is thanks to the idea of gods that human civilizations were able to grow and rapidly expand. As such, the ability to imagine things which don't necessarily exist is a major leap forward for humankind. We call this state of mind God-volitional, because the behaviors of the person seem to be the result of commands from a mentally generated authoritative presence. This presence is thought of as another person, and so a person who is bicameral, or who fully believes in God, never feels as though they are alone. The presence of a mental god acting as a dominant individual does not exclude actual tangible people from also assuming this role. The mental god is merely an additional factor, which is capable of producing submissive behavior in the individual in the absence of any other people. With these all-powerful beings watching us and judging us at all times, human behavior begins to develop into the civilized state we are all familiar with. Now, for reasons that are not entirely clear, this state of mind was somewhat unstable, and eventually gave way to consciousness and the birth of the ego. We describe this state as self-volitional, because the idea of the ego is responsible, or at least feels responsible, for action. This transformation likely has its roots in the gradual evolution of culture, as well as through the growing complexity of language, which supplies various metaphorical notions which expand the reach of consciousness. The idea of God still persisted for most of the conscious period, but the role of gods is less direct psychologically. God is still often felt to be the presence of a holy other, watching and judging our actions, but the individual begins to have a greater autonomy over themselves. The ego has replaced God. This ego is a metaphorical notion of the self, and once it emerges, it is on the basis of this ego that a person then directs their own behavior. Or as Julian Jaynes writes, the presence of voices which had to be obeyed were the absolute prerequisite to the conscious stage of mind, in which it is the self that is responsible, and can debate within itself, can order and direct, and that the creation of such a self is the product of culture. In a sense, we have become our own gods. Now, instead of being controlled by the will of a god, felt to be outside the person is directed by their ego, which in some sense is just the notion of an exterior other projected onto the self, in such a way that we identify with it. Anybody who has experienced ego death, or the disassociation of their ego, may at once recognize that the ego is not the entirety of the self, but rather an invented notion which enables human society to progress. As the psychoanalysts Esther and William Menaker put it, the way of organizing and integrating experiences of consciousness, as well as experiences that are unconscious, was made possible through the existence of a psychological apparatus we call ego. It evolved biologically as a concomitant of consciousness, and, like consciousness, is based in neurophysiological evolution. We can expect to find, then, in the hierarchy of living organisms, precursors of both consciousness and of ego, and in this sense, we can say that mind has existed from the beginning of life. However, when we arrive at the human species, the emergence of consciousness and its elaboration into verbal symbols, which can be retained and transmitted, introduces the dimension of psychological function on a new qualitative level. This is true, perhaps to an even greater degree, of the evolution of ego as an integrating apparatus. In the subhuman animal world, the integrating function is performed by innate behavioral patterns. In Freudian psychology, the ego is poised between the animalistic side of humans known as the id and the superego. The superego, which often includes the idea of God, can be thought of as a sort of replacement for God in the modern world, and it consists of all of the rules imposed upon us by society. These rules constantly interfere with our natural instincts, and the ego is caught between these opposing forces. The ego isn't merely navigating through society's rules, but is in some sense a product of them. If there were no societal rules being imposed on our instinctual nature, there would be no need to have an ego. The ego is a compromise between the subordinating will of the superego and our unconscious animalistic id. The superego almost acts as God, and in Carl Jung's opinion, it is essentially synonymous with the idea of God. As such, the ego is a product of a set of social standards decided by a culture, coming into conflict with our primitive instincts. The ego is now the commanding voice in human mentality, and we utilize our ego whenever we come up against a problem where habit does not suffice. In consulting ourselves before acting, we are in a sense consulting a higher authority, but we project this authority onto ourselves. However, the ego structures itself according to the rules of society, or even the rules imposed by an authority figure such as a parent. These ideas become internalized and structure a person's own ego. It is thus the will of an authority figure which becomes the initial directing impulse of a person, once this authoritative will is internalized and wrongly believed to be the person's own will. To put it another way, authority forces us to behave in certain ways, and we trick ourselves into thinking that we are our own authorities, and we call this authority our ego. First, an imaginary god takes on this role, and this god speaks to the person and imposes a culture's system of beliefs and values onto that person. The later psychological development is when this conception is considered oneself rather than the voice of another presence. Our feeling of self-awareness, which may become activated when we have anxiety or become embarrassed, is when the psychological stress caused by the presence of another individual or individuals, who may be seen as superior within the given social context, activates that primitive part of our brains which is able to recognize the presence of another individual, and so the primate instinct for dominance gives way to self-awareness. Imagine, for instance, that you were in front of a recording camera. With the knowledge that you are being filmed, your behavior will change, and it is the knowledge that another being, or in this case a camera, is watching you, that causes you to become self-aware. In a previous age, it was a hallucinatory god that produced this stress. The psychological history of mankind has progressed through a series of unusual developments. The human capacity for hallucinations and imaginations was a profound transformation, which is often overlooked today, but without this ability, governments, societies, and cultures would not be possible. The fictive basis for human society had its origins in the will of imaginary entities, who continue to influence many of us today, and who knows how our mentalities might evolve in the future. It is difficult to say whether mankind could have achieved our present level of progress without the ordering principle of a divine being in the early stages of culture. But it is clear that without the metaphysical conception of God, humanity may never have made the monumental leap towards consciousness. This leap has certainly benefited society, but it has psychological consequences for each of us at the individual level, where our sense of consciousness is responsible for many neurotic disturbances. In our series on the origins and history of consciousness, we will look at the birth of the ego through the lens of the evolution of internal archetypes, and will closely parallel many of the ideas presented in this video.